Good evening, everybody. Good evening to all those who've joined us here and joining us online. This week's Parsha is Parshas Toldot, and I begin the lesson tonight with one of my favorite stories. It's actually here in text number 1, but let me just give a little bit of a background on the author of this book. The author's name was Rabbi Herbert Weiner. Herbert Weiner originally was a Reform rabbi, and the Rebbe referred to him as my shliach in the Reform movement.
That's so interesting.
He came and interviewed the Rebbe,
Really
I believe on more than one occasion, and he had a connection with the Rebbe, a strong connection, correspondence with the Rebbe. And in his book 9.5 Mystics, he goes around interviewing 9.5 mystics, and he shares the insights that he gleaned from these conversations. So, in one of his conversations with the Rebbe, it's very telling. It's very, very telling, and there's so much we can unpack from this one story here. Tonight we're going to focus on one aspect of it, but let's read the story inside. It's really one of my favorites. Page 104. I opened my notebook and sat back in the chair, again conscious of how comfortable and relaxing it was in the Rebbe's office. Then I remembered that this was my last chance and resolved to ask even the most embarrassing questions in an effort to solve the enigma of Lubavitch. I explained to the Rebbe that more than a year had passed since I had been trying to understand the movement, and that I had come to him now with a confession. I did not understand. Would he mind if I started this interview by asking him about the character of a Chassid? Rabbi Menachem Mendel smiled and told me to go ahead. As before, I could speak English, but he would answer in Yiddish. As before, I could speak English, but he would answer in Yiddish. Isn't the fact that Chasidim turn to the Rebbe for almost every decision in their lives, isn't that a sign of weakness? A repudiation of the very thing that makes a man human, his bechira, his freedom of will? The Rebbe's answer came without hesitation, as if he had dealt with the question before. A weak person is usually overcome by the environment in which he finds himself. But our Chasidim can be sent into any environment, no matter how strange or hostile, and they maintain themselves within it. So how can we say that it is a weakness which characterizes a Chassid? And if I may just interject for a moment in this text, last night we participated in the International Conference of Shluchim, and it's so humbling to listen and to watch, to hear how you have colleagues who are 15 years your junior, 20 years, and they're going out to places like Uganda, Myanmar,
Montenegro, I forgot to look that up.
I mean, some of these places I can't even pronounce. But the idea that such young people who never really knew the Rebbe personally, I knew the Rebbe personally as a child. I spoke to the Rebbe personally as a child. I talked to him. I asked him a question. I asked him something. I questions, nothing deep. I informed him that my birthday was on a Shabbos, was on the coming Shabbos, and he wished me well. He wished me a good year. And on another occasion, I asked him for something. But other than that, I mean, okay. But these kids, they grew up without the Rebbe in their lives. So to imagine that these people have such devotion to his message, and they're going out to Timbuktu, literally, it's really humbling. It's really humbling and awe-inspiring, just awe-inspiring. And having been and being in a room with 6,000 of them, it just takes it to a whole new level. So let's continue here with Herbert Weiner's description of his yichidus, his meeting with the Rebbe. I pressed my question from another angle and told him that I sensed a desire in Chabad to oversimplify, to strip ideas of their complexity merely for the sake of a superficial clarity. As a matter of fact, I blurted out, all his Chasidim seem to have one thing in common, a sort of open and naive look in their eyes that a sympathetic observer might call tmimus, purity, but that might less kindly be interpreted as emptiness or simple-mindedness, the absence of inner struggle. I found myself taken aback by my own boldness, he says, but the Rebbe showed no resentment. He leaned forward. What you see missing from their eyes is a kera. A kera. A what? Yes, a kera, he repeated quietly, a split. The Rebbe hesitated for a moment. I hope you will not take offense, but something tells me you don't sleep well at night. And this is not good for length of days, for arichas yomim. That's the translation. Arichas yomim meaning long life. Perhaps if you had been raised wholly in one world or in another, it might be different. But this split is what comes from trying to live in two worlds. The Rebbe was pointing out to him that so many people try to straddle the fence of life and try to gain being both in this world and in the other world at the same time. And all that does is create tension in their lives. It creates confusion. And what you're seeing in the eyes of the Chasidim is that they're living in one world. They're not attempting to live in two different worlds. So, the question we very often struggle with is, who is the real me? Is the real me the one that wears a talis on Yom Kippur? If you're a man, I guess you would wear a talis on Yom Kippur and come to shul and spend time in prayer. Or is the one that's on the golf course the real me? Who is the real me? So that could be a source of tension in a person's life. It could be a source of confusion.
Wait, are you saying that a Chasidim wouldn't play golf?
Do Chasidim play golf? Possibly.
Play tennis or anything?
Possibly a Chassid might play golf for the purpose of exercise, or tennis is for the purpose of exercise and remaining healthy. That might be possible. Yeah, we'll see soon as the conversation evolves in the class that there is room for that, even if you're a Chassid. But the question is more in the mind. Who's the real me? And we'll see soon. There was also a famous author, just recently passed away, Herman Wouk.
Oh,
You may have heard of his name.
yeah.
Famous author, wrote many, many wonderful books. And he wrote a book called Inside Outside, which describes the challenges of growing up in America in the early 1900s, specifically growing up in New York. And in it, he charts the lives of members of his family and describes their struggles, which, along their journey was a very difficult thing. So how do we resolve this conundrum? How do we resolve this tension? Who is the real me? Is the real me the one who lights the menorah, who blows the shofar, who shakes the lulav and esrog on Sukkos? Or is it the one who goes to movies with friends? Who is the real me? So let's begin our discussion tonight with a verse from this week's Parsha, where we read about Yitzchak, Isaac, the second of the patriarchs. We talked a lot about him last week and how his model of living was the model that we wanted to use for true love in our marriages and our lives. And good evening. And let's move immediately to text number 2a. The Torah describes how Yitzchak sowed in the land. Yitzchak sowed in that land, and he found in that year a hundredfold, and God blessed him. He sowed, he worked the earth, he sowed, and what happened? The yield was a hundredfold. God blessed him with such abundance, it was 100 times what he expected would be produced, would be yielded by that area, by the amount of grain that he planted in that area of earth. In Rashi brings down over here in text 2b, he says 100-fold. What does this mean? For they had estimated how much the land was fit to produce, and it produced for each measure that they had estimated 100 measures. So this was just a great blessing, that it yielded a tremendous amount. Our sages state, and here's a second interpretation of Rashi, our sages state that the purpose of this estimate was to fulfill the mitzvah of tithing. In other words, this whole idea of us being given the the measurement here, that it was Mea Shi'arim, it was 100 measures, it doesn't mean it was 100 times. It just means that he made calculations in order to be able to take off a tithe. So Mea Shi'arim means he took 100% and he split the 100% into 10 segments, and the 10th, that's what he gave away. Now, aside for these two explanations that Rashi cites, there's a wonderful medrash that is in Pirkei de Rabbi Lezer. Pirkei de Rabbi Lezer, we've encountered this medrash in our Chumash Shir on Torah Be'iyun Thursday nights. We've encountered this medrash because this author, the source of Midrashim, there are lots of interesting and important comments there about the narrative of creation, Pirkei de Rebbe Lezer. And so in text number 3, here's what the Pirkei de Rebbe Lezer tells us. And Isaac sowed in that land. Rabbi Eliezer said, did Isaac sow the seed of corn? Heaven forbid. Rather, he took all his wealth and sowed it in charity to the needy. As it is stated, sow to yourselves in righteousness, reap according to love. Everything which he tithed, the Holy One, blessed be he, sent him in return 100 times the value in various types of blessings, as it is stated, and he found in the same year 100-fold, and God blessed him. So what this verse teaches us, says the Pirkei de Rebbe Lezer, is really not a reference to physical toiling, physical planting in the field and the yield of the crops. Says the Medrash, this can't be what it's talking about, because Yitzchak, it wouldn't be becoming of Yitzchak to be that mundane and be busy with planting in the field. Now, Rashi obviously excluded this commentary, this interpretation from his comments on the Torah. He brings down 2 interpretations, but he does not quote this third one, the one that we just read, that it was this, altruistic type of behavior that we're referring to. That he gave everything to tzedakah, whatever he gave to tzedakah, to charity, God repaid him 10 times or 100 times as much. So, the question we need to ask ourselves is, okay, so let's start at the beginning. So what did he actually sow? In other words, it's either this or that. You can't have both at the same time. And what's the problem, anyway, with sowing real seeds of corn? Like Lois correctly pointed out earlier, what's the big deal? I went to play tennis. What's the problem? So the question is a larger question. The question is very broad. What is our relationship with worldly pursuits? How do we categorize or characterize engaging the world around us? It seems like from the Medrash that Yitzchak was that type of person that didn't engage in the world. In fact, at least the third interpretation, all he did was he did charity. That's what he had, tremendous wealth, maybe perhaps because he inherited it from his father, and he engaged in charity. He helped the poor, he helped the starving, etc., the down and out, and God rewarded him with great bounty. Okay, all right. Sounds like from this medrash that Yitzchak had a different attitude towards engaging the world. The first 2 interpretations fully embraced this idea that Yitzchak actually sowed seeds of corn. So let's reframe the question for a moment. When we do a mitzvah, we do something, a divine command, a divine instruction, an ordinance. So we oftentimes have a vivid feeling of Jewishness. We feel close, to what we're doing. We feel close to Hashem. We feel spiritual. We feel good inside. We feel there's something holy going on. Something is percolating in our soul. But what about when we're driving our car? Or we're doing we're shopping? Or we're watching television? Or we're just hanging out with people? Do we feel the same way? We don't really feel the same way. We feel different. We feel very mundane. So the question is Judaism a 9-to-5 job that kind of is meant to be circumscribed, limited to certain periods in the day or certain activities during the day? Or is it really very much all-encompassing? It's a lifetime career. Do we clock in and clock out of religion? Or are we there over time and more over time and more over time? And the deeper question really is, who are we truly? Are we the person who leans towards, as we mentioned earlier, doing a mitzvah, or do we lean towards the mundane, the physical, the temporal, really? So we're going to suggest that we really only have one true self. Not two. One true self. Before we do that, let's talk a little bit about one of the novel ideas that the Hasidic tradition introduced to the Jewish world in a most meaningful way. Of course, the text that this idea is based on existed prior to the advent of Hasidism. Hasidism came, the horizon of, it came onto the horizon when? Approximately 300 years ago, 250, 300 years ago. This is when Hasidism rose, the Baal Shem Tov introduced the ideas to the masses, to the public. But the text existed earlier. It's just simply that he took the text and he demonstrated and he illuminated what the text really are meant to say, what they mean to say. I think I mentioned this last week, but I'll mention it anyway again. The previous Lubavitcher Rebbe was once sitting in a hotel, and he was meeting up with some fellow who asked him, of what purpose is the whole idea of Chassidus? Who needs Chassidus? We had Judaism for so many centuries and millennium. What's the necessity of something new? So the Friedrich Rebbe took a lighter, or whatever, he put it next to the wall, and on the wall there was beautiful wallpaper that had beautiful decorations, but because it was dimly lit, you could barely see those decorations. Now with the light near it, now I could see those beautiful decorations. So says the Friedrich Rebbe, says the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, tells this individual, this is what Chassidus does. It illuminates that which was there before, but you never noticed the beautiful design. It was always there on the wall, you just never took notice. Here we have a statement in the Pirkei Avos, in the Ethics of the Fathers, text number 4. Rabbi Yossi would say, the property of your fellow should be as precious to you as your own. Perfect yourself for the study of Torah, for it is not an inheritance to you. And all your deeds should be for the sake of heaven. All your deeds should be for the sake of heaven. What does this mean? In simple terms, it means that when a peripheral activity helps us succeed in our ultimate goal, so the peripheral activity also is elevated in the process. It also now is defined by some purpose. It's not purposeless. It's not useless. Now it's there actually to serve a higher purpose. Let's take, for example, eating. We're all enjoying wonderful, delicious Benny's pizza from Benny's Kosher Pizza here on River Road, which I encourage everybody to patronize. This is an important institution in Fair Lawn. That having been said, why are we eating? We're eating while we're learning so that we can learn better. Take a glass of tea and you sit down with a book of Torah and you're sipping the tea and you're learning. The tea is helping you learn. So what are you doing with the tea? You're elevating the tea. Now the tea has now assumed a higher purpose. If the tea is just there because I like tea, so that doesn't get elevated. If anything, it has the opposite effect. But if you're using the tea for a good purpose, for example, the Rebbe used to come home every evening, whatever time it was, the Rebbitzin would wait up for him and prepare tea for him. They would have tea together. They would spend a few minutes where they were both very much present. The Rebbe had the whole world on his head, but yet they took the time to converse and to have tea together. This was a regular occurrence. Regular occurrence. So what's the purpose of the tea? The purpose of the tea is to strengthen the bond of the marriage. That's a holy thing. That's a good thing. That's a positive thing. So now you've elevated something that's material and made it into something that serves a higher purpose. And if you didn't have all these things, a lot of that spirituality would have to ultimately not be achieved. We wouldn't make a blessing over food if we weren't eating food. We wouldn't be elevating the food if we weren't eating it for some spiritual purpose. But the food enables us to do that. If it's the food that enables us to do it, so now the food assumes a new identity, a higher identity. So everything has a purpose. Everything has a purpose, as I mentioned on Shabbos. The Rebbe taught this to us in 1990 in one of his landmark addresses that defined the purpose of shlichus, defined the whole concept of shlichus as we know today. People who are shluchim, they are the emissaries of the Rebbe. The Rebbe taught us that each emissary has a mission. What's the mission? The mission is to reveal within everything and every person that they come in contact with, Jew and non-Jew alike, what their mission is. And their mission is what? To do the same. So there's a godly divine purpose in everything. In text number 5, one form of religious service is reflected in the verse, all your deeds should be for the sake of heaven. In this understanding, the behavior is still considered your deeds. In other words, what he's saying is, all of your deeds should be for the sake of heaven. In other words, the deeds are your deeds, but you do it for the sake of heaven. Namely, not of spiritual nature, yet the motivation is not for reward or to look good or simply to amass wealth. Rather, the motivation is for the sake of heaven. Accordingly, there are two distinct elements here, the sake of heaven and your actions. There are two elements here. You're doing it for the sake of heaven, but they remain your actions. This person stands out in that he performs these actions in a manner that they should be for the sake of heaven. So the action remains mundane. But the beauty of it is that it has the ability, we have the ability to direct an independent force to the purpose that God designated it for. So sometimes we might feel this dichotomy. We might feel like we're not necessarily that godly oriented. We are just doing a mundane action, but we're directing it. We have this roadmap here that helps us bridge the gulf between, or the gap between, the mundane nature of the action and the spiritual purpose behind it. So its Jewish purpose becomes, or this Torah purpose, godly purpose becomes the center of gravity for as far as that activity is concerned. It's for the purpose. It's your action, it's a mundane action, but nonetheless it's directed in a good direction. The question has to be asked though, ultimately, at the end of the day, I'm sitting down to eat supper, it's wonderful, delicious food. So what do I feel? What do I sense? What am I feeling? At the end of the day, I don't feel all that godly when I'm eating. Yes, it's true, a person can do something for the sake of heaven. But ultimately, I still sense the mundane nature of the activity. Even though I know that the outcome is a divine outcome, is a good, godly outcome. At this very moment, though, I feel differently. I don't feel godly, I don't feel divine. I don't feel spiritual like I do when I'm in the shul, listening to the shofar being blown. We're doing another mitzvah. It doesn't feel the same. So here we have Chassidus introducing perhaps another layer, and a deeper understanding, a deeper appreciation for the process that we just described. In text number 6, this is a verse from Mishlei, from Proverbs. And here's what it says. Know him in all your ways, meaning know God in all your ways, and he will direct your paths. What's the difference between this statement and the earlier statement that all of your actions should be for the purpose of heaven? The difference is as follows. When an action which is mundane is directed towards the divine, the action remains mundane. And I'm just thinking that, it ultimately achieves a good purpose. The food is helping me concentrate on my Torah. But there's a deeper layer here too. Shlomo HaMelech in Proverbs is telling us, B'chol derachecha, in all of your ways, da'ehu, you should know God in the ways itself. The ways, in other words, the ma'asecha, the actions that you're taking, the things that you're doing, the path that you're taking, you got to know God there too. You have to see the divine within the action. And this is something that really was acutely demonstrated by the Baal Shem Tov, the original founder of Hasidism, and his students. We find a wonderful story, which I've repeated on a number of other occasions, of the two famous Hasidic brothers. One was Rebbe Zusha of Anipoli, and the other was Rebbe Elimelech of Lizhensk. Two great Hasidic sages, to whom many important teachings are attributed. Now, Rebbe Elimelech and Rebbe Zusha at one point were incarcerated on some kind of trumped-up charges, and they had to stay for a short while in prison. Now, you can imagine the prisons there weren't like the prisons we have here in America, where you could basically earn a nice degree sitting behind bars. Over there, they had many people in one room with one pail in the center or somewhere where you did what you had to do. You responded to your biological needs. So it came time to daven mincha. Daven mincha, you can't daven mincha in a place that has that kind of odor and that kind of presence. It's just not appropriate to daven there. The halacha tells us we don't daven in such a place. So the brothers are thinking to themselves, it's time to daven mincha. It's time to daven mincha. We're feeling not very good about the fact that we can't daven mincha. We're being prevented from davening mincha. And then one says to the other, wait a second. If God put us here and we have this very unpleasant experience, then it's obvious that right now what God wants us to do is not to daven mincha, because that's the law. So if God wants us not to daven mincha, then we should be joyous in the fact that we are able to fulfill what God wants, which is not to daven mincha. So here they go, they get up and they start dancing. They're joyous. Why are they joyous? Because we get to fulfill what God wants us to do, which is not to daven mincha. Well, sooner or later, the guard outside the cell gets wind of the fact that there are two bearded, side-locked, funny-looking Jews who are dancing around a pail. A pail of excrement, no less. He says, what? They're dancing for that stuff? I'm going to take it out. I'm going to deprive them of whatever's bringing them this joy. And lo and behold, that's exactly what he does. He removes it, the offensive substance, and Rebbe Zusha and Rebbe Elimelech get up to daven mincha. What's the point of the story? The point of the story is that they took notice of the divine even within the most unpleasant of things. They saw godliness in everything, not just in the mitzvah and the holiness of blowing shofar, but they saw God even in the most mundane and even in the most offensive. And that's something that the Baal Shem Tov really introduced to the Jewish world, this concept that God is everywhere, even in unpleasant places, even in places of impurity, God is there too.
Then why isn't it maybe okay to, if you have no other place to daven, to do it there? Like close your eyes or turn away or something. Why?
So
it's still a choice.
The concept needs a little bit more elaboration as to why that is so. You have a good question. But the idea is that God is more present in some places and less present overtly in other places. In other words, this concealment that we're experiencing of the divine is not a true concealment. It's a concealment as far as we are concerned, as far as our perception is concerned. Our lenses are not able to see and notice and feel the divine. We walk into a shul, we're in a place of holiness, God is there in a more revealed state. in a place that is offensive, that is impure, that is unholy, that is unbecoming, God is more concealed there. But the concealment itself is what the Baal Shem Tov taught, is also an expression and manifestation of godliness. God simply tells us that in a place where I'm concealed, I don't want you blessing me, because that's not what I want out of the world. I don't want concealment. I want to be revealed. In a shul where God's presence is more revealed, that's where I want you to bless me. That explains why there's this concept of avodah zarah, of serving an idol. If everything has a spark of divinity in it, then what's wrong with serving the idol? The answer is blatantly obvious and simple. Because this idol represents the fragmentation, the concealment of God, because you're not focusing on one God, you're focusing on a multiplicity. There's a concealment of the divine there. God doesn't want you worshiping concealment, worshiping an entity that portrays itself as being independent of God. And so the Baal Shem Tov introduced this concept that we need to appreciate godliness in everything, even in the most mundane. Okay. In text number 7, there is also a loftier path, concerning which the Talmud states there is a short passage that the entire Torah is dependent on it, namely the verse, "Know him in all your ways." What is the meaning? That one should know God. How does one know God? There is no way to know him other than Torah study and fulfilling the commandments. Yet the Rambam writes that this is accomplished through eating and drinking. So how does one know God? By eating in the exact same manner as when he studies Torah. The question is a valid question, and when one begins to serve God, the eating is only for the sake of heaven, emphasis added. Later, however, one arrives at a higher level, where his eating is akin to eating on Shabbos, which is an actual mitzvah. When one is eating for a mitzvah, the actual consumption is fulfilling the will of God, since God and his will are one. It is not that he eats so that he or she may study or perform a mitzvah later. Rather, the act of eating itself is a sort of mitzvah. An example of this would be eating the sacrifices in the temple, or participating in a siyum on a tractate of Talmud, or even more so, eating on Shabbos when we are commanded to eat fatty meats and aged wines. So too, eating meat and drinking wine is transformed into an act of mitzvah. So the difference between the first statement that we read in Pirkei Avos, of Kol Ma'asecha L'Shem Yu L'Shem Shamayim, all of your activities should be for the sake, for the purpose of heaven, and what we're learning now of Kol B'chol D'Rachacha Doyu, to know God in all your ways, the difference is great. There's a huge gulf between them, because Kol Ma'asecha Yu L'Shem Shamayim, all of your activities should be for the purpose of heaven, means that it's not for the purpose of heaven at this very moment. In other words, I'm not fulfilling a mitzvah in what I'm doing right now. I'm eating. I'm doing something mundane. B'chol D'Rachacha Do'eu is a whole nother mindset. The mindset of B'chol D'Rachacha Do'eu, of knowing God in all your ways, is that whatever I'm doing is really divine. It's like a mitzvah. At this very moment, it's like a mitzvah, because there's divine in everything.
Don't we elevate the food by saying a blessing over it?
We do elevate the food by saying a blessing over it, but despite that, even if you did make a bracha on it, which is important, critical I should say, but nonetheless, if a person makes the bracha and then only eats it for purposes other than serving God, meaning for something that's self-centered, out of self-absorption, then really the energy within it is not that much elevated. It still leaves quite a bit to be desired. Yes, a bracha is critical, because that elevates you to the mindset that it's all by the divine word that you have this.
Well, everything comes from God.
That's correct. But are you thinking about this while you're eating? Is the reason why you're eating for that purpose? That's where the fine line is.
Well, isn't it also gratitude?
Gratitude is important. Nobody's taking that away. But sometimes we could be gracious for such a delicious piece of food. In other words, nobody's negating here that we actually eat that food. You eat the food. The question is, what's your mindset? I recall hearing this from a colleague of mine here in New Jersey in the name of one of the teachers in the Chabad Yeshiva in Morristown, who recently passed away a few years ago. He was a tremendous genius of a man. He knew everything. He knew the entire Torah. Just amazing on his fingertips. You can call him and ask him a question, and it was like tremendous genius. His name was Rabbi Tzwiebel. That was his name. Anyway, so this colleague of mine asked this rabbi, so how do we apply these principles in actuality? So I'm sitting in the dining room in yeshiva, and I get one piece of chicken, and now, I usually tell the cook which one to give me, the white or the dark, So when I'm hungry, I go back to the kitchen for some more chicken. So how do I apply these principles in actuality? So he says, don't tell the cook which one to give you. Don't select which one you should. You need more chicken because you're hungry. Take more chicken by all means. But don't select it. Don't select this one. I like this one, because what you're doing when you do that is you're putting yourself in the mindset of why am I eating? Because I like this one. So nobody's saying you can't have the chicken. You can have the chicken. Go ahead and eat the chicken. But what's your mindset when you're eating it? Your mindset, okay, this is what was given to me, so I'm eating it. Why am I eating? Because I need energy to serve God. It's a different mindset. It's a different perspective. So the way to circumvent the trap of being absorbed in what my preferences in terms of food is whatever you want. Your wife makes food for you. Your husband makes food for you. Whatever it is. Whatever it is, it's all good. It's all good.
You sound like Zach.
All right. So this is the difference. The difference between kol ma'asechel yu l'shem shamayim, between all your activities should be for the sake of heaven, means you're not doing a mitzvah now. You're not seeing the divine in the act, in the mundane itself. Kol b'chol derechecha do'eu, know God in all your ways, means you're knowing God in everything. You're seeing the divine in everything. Like the two brothers saw the divine even in the unpleasant.
So does that mean that if the person enjoys the taste of what he's eating and finds it pleasurable, that's somehow ungodly?
Are you seeing godliness in that? Or are you seeing yourself in that? What is that strength? What
God's
notion?
Not eating it, I guess.
Huh?
Since God's not eating it, you are. I guess you're seeing yourself.
So what's the motivation for it? So a person has to be very much self-aware and know themselves. What's the reason? What's the real reason why I want that? And what happens is, as a person progresses, a person lives their life, and they're used to always following. If a person always eats the things that he likes or she likes, just because I like it, so where does that lead the person to? Ultimately, to remaining a very self-centered individual. Because it's always about me. It's always about what I desire and what I appreciate and what tastes good on my palate, and nothing else matters.
And to excess, possibly.
And to excess. Exactly. So the next thing is an entire tub of ice cream. Or, whatever it might be. I mean, just think of the scenarios. There could be a million of them. So this is the difference. So we're never really off the hook. Never really off the hook. There's always, it's not like there's an off time. We're always in the service of the divine. We're always in the service of God, regardless of what we are doing, regardless of where we are. We're always in uniform. Okay, so we answered the question. Sounds a little sketchy to me. Still a little bit sketchy. Why? Because at the end of the day, when I eat that steak, I'm really feeling my own appetite. I'm really serving my own appetite. At the end of the day, if I take a nice, long, hot shower, I feel like I just indulged myself. That's really... So who are we fooling?
I got a question. I mean, the Rambam says we have to eat to have energy to study Torah.
Yeah.
And to keep ourselves healthy. And
True.
Even at the end of the day, when you have a steak, You're going to study Torah later, so why can't you do that?
Nobody says you can't. The question is, what is your focus? What are you thinking? What is your mindset?
Oh, it's for energy too.
If somebody handed it to you
Protein.
and it wasn't your choice, this is what I have for supper, so I'm going to eat this for supper because this is what God wants me to apparently have for supper, so I need the energy. I'm going to use the energy to serve God.
You gotta also eat
The question is, was this your choice? Are you after this? Is this something that you're focused on or not?
Why would you not look at it as, thank you, God, that I have this wonderful opportunity I have?
Look at it that way too.
But yeah, that I get to have this luxurious thing. It's wonderful. Thank you, God. Instead of, just be a plain piece of whatever. And looking at it that way, that gets elevated because thank you, God, for this. That much more.
I don't think one has to discount the other. I think gratitude is critical. Thanking God for the wonderful food that I have.
But that I have the opportunity to have that you are granting me this, as opposed to okay, whatever, I'll have the cereal because.
That's a fair question.
Okay, but.
Let me try to respond, even though I don't want to get too
I don't want to take you
too deep into
No, I agree with you.
into the nitty gritty here. But let me just respond to that. We talked about this a while ago. There is a wonderful book written called "On the Essence of Chassidus," and in that work, which is from the Rebbe, so he quotes a story of a student of the Alter Rebbe. I think his name was Rabbi Kusil Lepler. That was his name. And Alter Rebbe wanted to bless him with long life. So first he wanted to bless him with riches. Didn't want to take it. Bless him with long life. So he said, I'll accept the blessing, but on one condition. That it's not poyer ishiyorin. A poyer is like a very crass individual who doesn't recognize the divine in his life. In other words, not just talking about somebody who's not gracious and doesn't feel gratitude to God. We're talking about somebody who, it's about materialism. His life revolves around materialism. And then the Rebbe went on to explain, after reciting the story, he went on to explain the concept of Moida Ani. What is the theme of Moida Ani? When we say this in the morning, we get up in the morning, we say Moida Ani, we thank God for our life. So we're being gracious, we're expressing gratitude to Hashem for my life. So the Rebbe explains that the words of Moida Ani, I'm thanking God, Shechazarta bi nishmasi, that you've returned my soul to me, is not just a reference to my ordinary soul. It's my Jewish soul. What's the difference between an ordinary soul and my Jewish soul? The difference is huge. The ordinary soul is like the poyer. Who all he sees is materialism. As far as he's concerned, that's what life revolves around. So he thanks God for the materialism. As far as the Jew is concerned, his godly soul sees purposefulness in all the materialism. He sees purposefulness in everything that's mundane. And so everything that he experiences has got a purpose to it, has to have a purpose to it. And he quotes, he tells us, gives us an analogy. Think about it this way, he says. Think about a prince who was raised in the palace of the king. And then the king decides, you know what he's going to do? He's going to take the prince and put him into the shed and put him into the horse, into the stable with all the horses. He'll have food. He'll have drink. He'll have whatever he needs physically to be able to continue breathing and being alive. But to live as the prince lived in the palace, he's not going to be able to. So as far as the prince is concerned, that life doesn't cut it. The prince wouldn't want that type of life. Why? Because he values something that much greater. Living in his father's presence, the king's presence, and experiencing the majesty of the palace and the incredible things that go on there makes this type of life not worth living. Yes, a person could survive in a stable, but who wants to live that way? So in a similar way, a Jewish soul, the divine soul, has an appreciation for the divine at such a level of intensity that it, as far as the materialism mundane is concerned, that type of life is not the type of life it wants to live. It's not thanking God Moda Ani in the morning for that type of life. It's thanking God, you've given me the opportunity to live in this physical world and elevate the physical world to something that's much greater and much higher. So are we gracious? We're expressing gratitude to Hashem. We say Moda Ani, just like in the bracha before we eat. But what are we really being gracious for? Or what are we being grateful for, I should say? I'm not saying gracious. Grateful for. We're being grateful for the opportunity to elevate the physical, to elevate the mundane, rather than engage in almost, I don't want to call it, I'll use the word, a down spiraling process of engaging in the mundane, in the physical. Because once that happens, then it's all about me. It's all about what I desire, what makes me feel good, and then I become a self-absorbed, self-oriented individual. It's much less about God in my life. God isn't really part of my life. God is really just a nuisance who I have to be grateful for whatever He gave to me.
So I don't get it. Is the prince supposed to say it's okay living in the stable?
The prince says no. The prince says absolutely no. I don't want life in the stable. I only want life in the palace.
But then it's all about him.
But then he's choosing a better life for himself.
What's wrong with that?
I thought you said that's not,
Well, it's like choosing food that you want.
yeah.
It's like going into a restaurant. Why would you choose this over this? And why wouldn't you choose something you like?
You choose in a restaurant. You choose the healthy food. You choose the food that's healthy for you. That's the most beneficial for you.
That's true.
That's the kind of food you should choose. You go to a restaurant because you didn't have time to make supper, or because it's a special occasion and you're looking to strengthen a relationship. You have a larger, greater purpose to it. You're not just going because you happen to like their delicacy that they serve on Mondays at 8 o'clock, not at 7 o'clock. Okay. So, when we eat on Shabbos and we're doing a mitzvah, our taste buds feel great. The palate feels great. And it's a mitzvah. So who are we fooling? At the end of the day, I feel very much mundane, even when I'm doing something that we characterize as a mitzvah. So, let's first take a look at another model of a human being who we know from our Warrior to Warrior class on Sunday evening is not a common occurrence. It's not the default type of human being. It's the human being who's fully righteous. He's the tzaddik. We talked about the tzaddik is the 1% versus the 99%. We're the 99%. We're the intermediate level in terms of serving God. We have the potential to be fully in control of our activity, of our behavior, and yet don't really ever conquer fully, and meaning transform fully, our evil inclination. So there's a wonderful story they tell of the Alter Rebbe, the Baal Tanya, the author of the Tanya, where he was going to have a distinguished guest. His name was Rabbi Shlomo of Karlin, another great Hasidic Rebbe. He came to visit the Alter Rebbe. So, knowing that they were going to have a distinguished guest coming to their home, the family of the Alter Rebbe prepared food. So what do they prepare? They prepare a wonderful soup. But there's the disagreement as far as who gets the merit of preparing the food. So the Rebbetzin, the Alter Rebbe's wife, who was apparently a little older already, she already had some grown children, and her daughter, Freidke, wanted to make all the food, but she insisted on making the food for such a special guest. Even though Freidke was the one now who basically took care of the kitchen. So finally the Alter Rebbe had to intervene. So the Alter Rebbe said, okay, Mommy is going to make the food, the Rebbetzin is going to make the food, Freidke will add the salt. Things didn't actually turn out that way. The Rebbetzin made the food. She put in all the spices, including the salt. Came along Freidke, and she wasn't ready to lose out on her, and she perhaps didn't even know that her mother already put in the salt. So she added a second dose of salt to whatever was the measure that had to be. So there was twice as much salt as there was necessary. So the dish is served, the soup comes out. Reb Shlomo is sitting by the table, the Alter Rebbe is sitting by the table. They serve the soup. The Alter Rebbe starts to eat. Reb Shlomo can't eat the soup. So the Alter Rebbe is like, "What? Something's wrong with the soup?" He says, "Yeah, there's a little too much salt." Too much salt? Too salty? Really? I don't know. Let me try. Let me see. Puts a little more salt in his, and he continues eating. And the Alter Rebbe says to his friend, his colleague, the Shlomo of Karlin, he says, from the time that I journeyed to Mezrich is the city where his mentor, the Maggid of Mezrich, comes from, to my Rebbe, the Rebbe explained, I have not sensed the taste of food. Alter Rebbe says, from the time that I went to Mezrich, in other words, from the time that he had joined the Maggid's students, he experienced this type of spiritual elevation which most people don't experience, and his taste just was weakened to the point where it didn't make any difference anymore. His physical taste. So, yes salt, no salt, more salt, it's all the same. So basically he made a decision to be completely devoted to his pursuit of godliness, and therefore the taste became immaterial to him. There's another great story. They tell of a Yid, his name was Mendel Deitch. Mendel Deitch and his wife Hinda were in a city called Samarkand, which you may have heard about. Yeah, we have one of our students and participants has traveled there and visited. It's a wonderful, very interesting place. A lot of Jewish refugees ended up there during the Second World War. They wanted to run away from the front, so they went all the way deep to Uzbekistan and Samarkand. So, what happened? Mendel Deitch had a lot of refugees coming to his home, and he used to make a soup every day. He got one of the refugees to stand there giving the soup out, and he would join the line. He didn't want to benefit from the mitzvah itself by taking soup on his own. He's going to be just like everybody else. He's going to go wait in line just like everybody else. He didn't want to benefit from it. It's a similar idea. I don't think he was a tzaddik like the Alter Rebbe, but nonetheless, this was a very pious type of, devout type of behavior. So in general, we feel more holy when we blow shofar. When we're in shul, where we're doing a mitzvah, where we're doing something special, where we're kind to people, we feel very holy. But when we're eating a steak, we don't feel holy. But as far as the tzaddik is concerned, he does. He really does feel the same. For him, it's the same thing. The story of the Alter Rebbe also, that the Rebbe told over in one of his talks, one of his first talks, is that the Alter Rebbe, on Yom Kippur, took off his talis, walked to the other side of town. This is in our Chabad tradition, the annals of Chassidus, this is something that's brought down. The Rebbe quoted it. So I'm full confidence that this is a story that actually happened with the Alter Rebbe, not with somebody else that they quote in the name of. But he walked to the other side of town. Apparently he knew that there was a woman who had just given birth, who had nobody to help her. And it's freezing cold. He goes and he chops wood. And don't forget, Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur, you're not allowed to do this kind of thing. Chops wood, lights a fire for her, and cooks a soup for her. In other words, chopping the wood and cooking something up for a woman who just gave birth is just as important, if this is the call of the hour, than just important as standing in shul with your talis during Kol Nidrei and reciting the prayers. So it's all the same. So the tzaddik, it's all the same. What does God want from me is really the key. What does God want? That's really that was the idea that the Mashpia Rabbi Tzvi was telling this colleague of mine. What does God want from you ultimately at this moment? He wants you to eat. Fine, to eat. Question: what you want? Don't mix yourself in. Don't make what you want. What God wants you to do. Okay, that was the point. Now, taking this to a halachic context, I know we're running out of time, but a halachic context. There's a very interesting law. On Shabbos, we know we don't carry outside. Carrying outside, where there's no Erev, here in Fairlawn, thank God we have an Erev, a wonderful Erev. And shout out to our wonderful Erev team. The various rabbis in the community who volunteer to check it and get involved. But here's a very interesting law. When you carry something, there has to be a shear, there has to be a certain measure, a certain amount that makes it significant to carry. In other words, if it's not significant, if you're carrying a piece of dust in your pocket, nobody cares about it, nobody regards that. Torah doesn't regard that as carrying. Carrying has to be significant. So there has to be a certain measurement for the carrying, in order to be considered carrying. What happens if you have a very small measurement of food in a very large vessel, but the only reason why you're moving the vessel, you're carrying the vessel, is because you have that measure of food inside. But the measure of food is too small to be regarded as truly significant, incurring any transgression. You have a big pot and a little teeny bit of food. That little teeny bit of food is not significant enough. This doesn't measure up. It's not large enough to be considered a significant measure that you would be liable for. So you bring it out in a large pot. This is just a what if. People don't usually do this every day. In text number 8, if one carries out less than the standard quantity of food in a utensil, he is not liable for the utensil because the utensil is auxiliary to the food. In other words, you're not liable, not for the food because it's too small. And the only reason why you're carrying the utensil is only to support the food. So you're not liable for the utensil either, even though the utensil is clearly a significant item. And normally, under normal circumstances, if you didn't have the food in there and you were just carrying out the utensil on its own, you would be liable because you're carrying the utensil. Why? Because your focus is the utensil. What's the idea here? The utensil, regardless of its size, is subservient, if I could use that word, to the small measure of food inside the utensil. And so just like you're not liable for the food because it's too small of a measure, it's not the shear, the utensil also becomes basically insignificant relative to the food because that's your intention. Halachically, we don't consider the utensil a substance, an object which has substance, an object which is significant to incur penalty for. Why? Because it's only there to serve a larger purpose. What's the larger purpose? That little bit of food. Now, it just happens to be because the food is too small, you're not liable for the food. But the idea is that this large, bulky utensil doesn't incur any penalty. Why? Because you're only carrying it for a different purpose. You're not carrying it for itself. So you see here the same concept applies. What's the reason why you're doing it? So you can have a very big, bulky utensil, you could have a lot of food, but if the food is there to serve something more important, it doesn't have significance of its own. It's the same food. But the question is, what's the mindset? What's the mindset behind it? You see where I'm going with this? In text number 9, the vessel ceases to exist as an independent object. For were it to exist as any sort of object, then it would constitute a full-fledged object that is being carried from domain to domain. Inasmuch, however, as it ceases to be an independent object, only existing for its contents, the specific vessel has no relevance. On the contrary, it is absurd to say that he carries the vessel, an act that would incur a sacrificial obligation, or if done intentionally, the death penalty. Rather, since he is carrying food or drink, which in this specific circumstance is not punishable when carried within a vessel, the vessel is inconsequential, and therefore he is exempt, since the food or drink are less than the measure of obligation. Another concept in halacha: whatever a servant or an indentured slave acquires, he acquires it for his master. We talked a little bit about this, alluded to this on Shabbos. Eliezer, when it comes to Besul, what's the first thing he says? You ever met a person who says, but you ask him his name, who are you? He says, I'm the servant of my master. He'll tell you his name. I'll tell you what happens to be. I'm also a servant. Here, Eliezer is saying, Eved Avram, I'm the servant of Avram. That's who I am. That's my identity. Whatever Masha Kono Eved Kono Rabbi, whatever a slave acquires, his master acquires in his stead. A wonderful analogy is also brought from a new, relatively new concept, which is called a selfie. You ever took a selfie?
They have those long sticks.
Long stick so you can take a nice selfie, right? That makes the selfie nicer. But what's the purpose of the selfie? What's the purpose of the selfie? Myself.
Right.
Everything in the background is just background. But I want the background. I want the background, but I want myself on the background. So what's the most important, what's the most pronounced part of it, the prominent part of that picture? Myself. It's a selfie.
There's other people in the picture too.
Yeah, but they're in the background. They're just background noise. The real reason why I'm taking the picture is to have myself on the backdrop of these people, or in this place. So that's the focus. The focus is myself, and that's the idea of the selfie. So now, is there any way that we can experience the selflessness that a tzaddik feels when he eats or she eats? Is there any way that we can experience even a glimpse of that? So in text number 12a, I'm going to skip over to text 11. In 12a, because the hour is late, we'll just try to move along. Along comes the medrash that states that for an ordinary person who is not a forefather, meaning not somebody like Yitzchak Avinu, the path is to serve God for the sake of heaven, namely to harvest physical grain, measure that grain, and then tie that grain. However, when discussing our father Yitzchak, he was, after all, likened to a chariot that is completely auxiliary to its rider. It is not as if the chariot possesses an independent will which luckily aligns with the will of the rider. Rather, it has no independent identity. There is only the rider in a chariot which is completely auxiliary to him. So in the Medrash's view, when we speak of Isaac, how can we even mention harvesting grain? In other words, the Medrash sees Isaac as this incredibly spiritual, godly individual. How could you even suggest that he was planting actual grain? That's the Medrash's perspective, because he's a tzaddik. When he does something, he's transparent to the divine will. So what, he's going to get involved in that kind of materialism? In text number 11b, if this medrash has been transmitted to us, says the Rebbe, we must ask ourselves, what purpose does it serve if it has no relevance to us at all? We're not tzaddikim. We're of the 99%. We must conclude that at certain times and in certain situations, this ideal approach is attainable in some small way, even for the simplest of people. This is wonderful. We are able to witness clear representations of this. When a Jew is in a state of great joy, if he or she is presented with something overly salted or overly bland, they will swallow it and not even feel the taste of the food. This is due to their exceedingly happy state of mind and complete lack of attention to the food. Yes, he or she has made a blessing and is eating the food, and even eats the required amount of food that warrants an after blessing, yet their attention is not on the food. In other words, when you're in a state of mind of tremendous joy, you marry off your only child, you're experiencing boundless joy. There's nothing that tops that priority at this very moment. Right now, I'm fully present in this incredible joy that I'm experiencing. And when a person is in that mindset, yes, salty, not salty, I didn't notice. So we can, even ordinary people, says the Rebbe, can have a glimpse, can gain a glimpse of this tzaddik-like activity and tzaddik-like behavior that we normally, under normal circumstances, don't have. It's extraordinary, doesn't happen every day, but it can. There's a little bit that we can gain from it. It's possible to have a little bit of it. And just a couple of contemporary examples of where we should try, or we can try, I should say. We can try to experience some of that. Say, for example, we get a paper delivered to our home. Today's day and age is not that common because now everything's on the internet. But nonetheless, we still get community news, right? The community news that, I don't know if anybody actually reads that news. Certainly not fair law news. But regardless, you go out to get the paper from the curb, and you happen to notice that your recently widowed neighbor is walking around outside, this is an opportunity from God He's presenting you with, not to get your paper. The real thing here, the real purpose here, is to go share a kind word. recognize the opportunity that you have. That's the real divine purpose of what you're doing. And then the big bulky vessel is completely nullified to the small measure of food inside of it. Another example, you're driving to work. See if anybody needs a carpool. See if anybody needs a ride.
Or stop for a pedestrian.
Stop for a pedestrian if you feel safe enough to do so. If you feel safe enough to do so. Some people might not. But, yeah.
Right.
Huh?
Obviously.
Obvious.
Not for
But a
pedestrian.
lot of people don't even.
I mean, stop and let them cross the street?
Yeah.
You go to a restaurant. So maybe see if there's an entree that you can have for somebody who's really in need, who could use the food, who might need something. You know, somebody who's working very hard and doesn't have time to stop and eat. Bring them something to eat.
Did that for that.
We need to find ways of little pockets of time. Find the little pockets of time in our lives where we can be elevated to this mindset, to this experience. And so ultimately there are moments when the world can cease to revolve around us and our personal desires, and we could focus on something and try to gain some experience, some experience as the tzaddik does from time to time. And then we could take the photo, the photo without it being a selfie. We could take the photo and it becomes something where the people in the background actually come to the forefront, and they're the focus of the photo. They're the focus of the picture. So with that, I want to wish everybody a wonderful evening. And thank you for joining us online, here in the flesh. And God willing, we'll be continuing next week, Monday evening, same time, same place, and same channel.
This was a complicated list.
Yeah, something